The UEN transport shuttle descended through the thick, hazy atmosphere of the backwater planet, its engines thrumming with a dull roar. Inside the cramped confines of the shuttle, Grant sat with his head bowed, his thoughts consumed by the events that had brought him to this moment. It had been 6 months since the outbreak on the Ulysses, 6 months since he and the other survivors had been plucked from the wreckage of the doomed ship and placed into quarantine. The UEN had been quick to act, isolating anyone who had come into contact with the zombie virus in a secret containment facility on this remote, forgotten world. As the shuttle touched down on the landing pad, Grant stood and stretched his muscles, his body still aching from the long journey. He stepped out into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the glare. Before him stood the quarantine prison, a sprawling complex of gray, featureless buildings surrounded by towering walls and bristling with armed guards. It was a stark, lifeless place, a far cry from the vibrant, bustling worlds he had once explored as a member of the UEN. As he was led inside by a team of heavily armed soldiers, Grant couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over him. He had spent his entire career fighting to protect the innocent, but now he found himself on the other side of the fence, a potential threat to be contained and studied. The days inside the prison blurred together, a monotonous routine of medical tests, psychological evaluations, and long hours spent in isolation. Grant did his best to keep himself occupied, spending his time reading, exercising, and trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life. But despite his best efforts, he could feel the tension and unease growing among the other prisoners. Many of them had been exposed to the virus through no fault of their own, ordinary civilians who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were scared, angry, and desperate for answers that the UEN seemed unwilling or unable to provide. Grant did what he could to keep the peace, using his natural leadership skills to calm frayed nerves and diffuse potential conflicts. He organized group discussions and activities, encouraging the prisoners to share their experiences and lean on each other for support. But even as he worked to maintain order, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scientists and doctors who oversaw the facility seemed increasingly agitated and secretive, whispering amongst themselves in hushed tones and casting furtive glances at the prisoners. And then, one day, everything changed. It started with a scream, a blood-curdling shriek of terror that echoed through the halls of the prison. Grant was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding in his chest as he raced towards the sound. He burst into the common area to find a scene of utter chaos. Prisoners were running and shouting, their faces contorted with fear and panic, and in the center of the room, a figure stood hunched and snarling, its skin mottled and gray, its eyes blazing with a feral, inhuman hunger. Grant felt his blood run cold as he realized the truth. The virus had resurfaced, and the nightmare was beginning anew. He looked around at the terrified faces of the prisoners, seeing the same fear and desperation that he had witnessed on the Ulysses. And in that moment he knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out clear and strong above the din. "Listen to me," he shouted, his eyes blazing with determination. "We have to work together if we're going to survive this. We need to find a way out of here, to get to safety before it's too late." The prisoners looked at him, their eyes wide with hope and fear. And in that moment, Grant felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a clarity of focus that he had never known before. He would lead these people to safety, no matter the cost. He would fight with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed to protect the innocent and stop the spread of this terrible virus. The outbreak had begun, but Grant would not let it consume them. He would stand against the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world gone mad. And as he looked out at the sea of frightened, determined faces before him, he knew that he would not face this fight alone. The zombie's snarls filled the air as it lunged towards the nearest prisoner, its jaws snapping with a sickening crunch. Grant leapt into action, tackling the creature to the ground and driving his fist into its skull with a savage fury. Around him, the common area erupted into chaos as more zombies began to appear, their bodies twisting and contorting as the virus took hold. Prisoners screamed and ran, their panic feeding the growing horde's frenzy. Grant scrambled to his feet, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. They needed weapons, a defensible position, and a plan of action. He scanned the room, his gaze falling on a group of guards who had responded to the commotion. "You there?" he shouted, pointing to the nearest guard. "We need weapons and a safe zone. We have to contain this outbreak before it spreads any further." The guard hesitated for a moment, his eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. But then he nodded, tossing his sidearm to Grant and motioning for the other guards to follow suit. Grant caught the weapon, checking the chamber and flicking off the safety. He turned to the prisoners, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Anyone who can fight, grab a weapon and follow me. We need to secure the armory and establish a perimeter. Move." A small group of prisoners stepped forward, their faces etched with determination and grim resolve. Among them were a few former military personnel, their training and experience evident in their stance and bearing. Grant led the way, his impromptu squad falling in behind him as they fought their way through the prison corridors. Zombies lurched and shambled towards them, their bodies riddled with bullet holes as the survivors cut them down with ruthless efficiency. They reached the armory, the heavy metal door still sealed and intact. Grant motioned for two of the prisoners to take up defensive positions while he worked on the lock, his fingers flying over the keypad with practiced skill. The door swung open, revealing a cache of weapons and equipment. Grant grabbed a rifle, tossing it to one of the prisoners before snatching up a few extra magazines and a combat knife. "Arm yourselves and get ready," he barked, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. "We need to fortify this position and then start clearing the prison block by block." The survivors set to work, barricading the entrances and setting up makeshift defenses. They worked quickly and efficiently, their movements fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge that every second counted. As they labored, Grant's mind raced with questions and possibilities. How had the virus resurfaced? Were there any other survivors out there? And most importantly, how were they going to escape this nightmare and warn the UEN of the impending danger? He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. They had to survive, to find a way out of this hellhole and get to safety. Everything else could wait. Hours passed as they fought and struggled, the zombie horde seeming to grow with every passing minute. They lost a few of their number, brave souls who sacrificed themselves to buy the others precious seconds of life. But through it all, Grant remained resolute, his leadership and skill keeping the survivors focused and determined. They had secured the armory, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the zombies overran their position. They needed to escape, to find a way out of the prison and to the nearby spaceport. It was a desperate plan, but it was their only hope. Grant gathered the survivors, his face grim and his voice steady. "Listen up," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. "We can't stay here. The zombies will overrun us eventually, and we'll be trapped like rats in a cage. We need to make a break for the spaceport, to find a shuttle and get off this rock." The survivors looked at him, their eyes wide with fear and trepidation. But Grant could see the glimmer of hope in their expressions, the desire to live and to fight another day. "It won't be easy," he continued, his voice hard and unyielding. "We'll have to fight our way through the horde, and there's no guarantee we'll all make it. But it's our only chance. Are you with me?" One by one, the survivors nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They would follow Grant to the end, no matter the cost. And as they prepared to make their desperate bid for freedom, Grant felt a flicker of hope spark to life within him. They had survived the outbreak on the Ulysses, and they would survive this too. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, but they would face it together. As one, the survivors stepped forward, their weapons at the ready and their hearts filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve. The fight for survival had only just begun. The heavy metal doors of the armory swung open, revealing the grim, determined faces of the survivors. They stepped out into the prison corridor, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Grant took point, his rifle sweeping the hallway as he motioned for the others to follow. They moved quickly and quietly, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence that had settled over the prison. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of zombies, their bodies twisted and grotesque, their eyes blazing with a feral hunger. Grant opened fire, his bullets tearing through the creature's flesh and bone. The survivors joined in, their weapons barking and flashing in the dimly lit corridor. They fought with a savage fury, driven by the desperate need to survive and escape this nightmare. But even as they cut down the zombies, more appeared, their numbers seeming to grow with every passing moment. Grant knew they couldn't stay here, couldn't allow themselves to be trapped and overwhelmed. He motioned for the survivors to fall back, to make their way towards the prison's exit. They fought their way through the winding corridors and cell blocks, their progress slowed by the relentless onslaught of the undead. As they neared the exit, they came across a group of survivors huddled in a corner, their faces etched with fear and desperation. Among them were a few guards and doctors, their once pristine uniforms now stained with blood and grime. Grant approached them, his voice low and urgent. "We're heading to the spaceport," he said, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces before him. "We have a chance to escape this place, but we need to move fast. Will you join us?" The survivors looked at each other, their eyes wide with uncertainty. But then, one by one, they nodded, their decision made. They would take their chances with Grant and his group, rather than face the horrors of the prison alone. The expanded group set off once more, their numbers bolstered by the new additions. They fought their way through the prison's outer perimeter, the zombies pressing in on them from all sides. They lost several of their number in the chaos, brave souls who fell to the undead's relentless assault. Grant felt each loss like a knife to the heart, but he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that he had to save as many as he could. As they finally emerged from the prison, the harsh sunlight of the planet's surface nearly blinded them. They blinked and squinted, their eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. Before them lay a vast, desolate landscape, the spaceport visible in the distance. It was a daunting sight, the journey ahead filled with unknown dangers and challenges. But Grant knew they had no choice. They had to reach the spaceport, had to find a way off this planet before the virus consumed them all. He turned to the survivors, his face grim and his voice steady. "We have a long way to go," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. "And there's no telling what we'll face out there. But we have to keep moving, have to stay focused on our goal. We can do this, but we have to work together." The survivors nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew the odds were against them, knew that many of them might not make it to the spaceport alive. But they also knew that they had no choice. They had to try, had to fight with every ounce of strength and will they possessed. And so, with Grant leading the way, they set off across the barren, unforgiving landscape, their hearts filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, but they would face it together. They were survivors, warriors forged in the crucible of this nightmare. And they would not go quietly into the night. The sun beat down mercilessly on the weary survivors as they trudged across the barren landscape, their feet kicking up clouds of dust with every step. They had been walking for hours, their bodies pushed to the limits of endurance by the relentless pace set by Grant. But even as they struggled against exhaustion and dehydration, they knew they couldn't stop. The zombies were still out there, lurking in the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As they crested a hill, the spaceport came into view, its towering structures and gleaming metal surfaces a welcome sight after the desolation of the prison. But even from a distance, they could see that something was wrong. Smoke billowed from several of the buildings, and the sound of gunfire and screams echoed across the landscape. The spaceport was under attack, the zombie horde having already breached its defenses. Grant felt a sense of dread wash over him, but he pushed it aside. They had come too far to turn back now, and the spaceport was their only hope of escape. He motioned for the survivors to take cover, to conserve their strength and ammunition for the battle ahead. They crouched behind boulders and debris, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the spaceport for any sign of movement. As they watched, a group of survivors emerged from one of the buildings, their faces etched with terror and desperation. They were being pursued by a horde of zombies, the creatures' snarls and howls filling the air. Grant knew they had to act fast. He signaled to his group, and they rose as one, their weapons barking and flashing as they opened fire on the zombies. The creatures fell in droves, their bodies riddled with bullets. But more kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Grant and his survivors fought their way towards the spaceport, their progress slowed by the relentless onslaught of the undead. They dodged and weaved, their movements fluid and precise, their training and experience guiding their every action. As they neared the spaceport's entrance, they came face to face with a group of survivors, their faces haggard and their eyes wild with fear. They were armed and desperate, and they seemed to view Grant and his group as a threat. Grant held up his hands, his voice calm and steady. "We're not here to fight you," he said, his gaze locking with the leader of the other group. "We're here to escape, just like you. We need to work together if we're going to make it out of here alive." The other survivors hesitated, their weapons still trained on Grant and his group. But then, slowly, they lowered their guns, their faces etched with wary acceptance. Together, the two groups fought their way into the spaceport, their combined firepower cutting a swath through the zombie horde. They made their way to the hangar bay, where a single shuttle sat waiting, its engines humming with power. But as they approached the shuttle, a massive wave of zombies surged towards them, their numbers greater than anything they had faced before. Grant knew they couldn't hold them off for long, knew that they had to get the shuttle airborne before it was too late. He turned to the other survivors, his face grim and his voice urgent. "Get the shuttle ready for takeoff," he barked, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. "I'll hold them off for as long as I can." The survivors hesitated, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. But then, one by one, they nodded, their decision made. They would follow Grant's lead, would trust in his skill and courage to see them through. As the survivors worked to prep the shuttle, Grant and a handful of others took up defensive positions around the hangar bay. They fought with a savage fury, their weapons flashing and their bodies moving in a deadly dance. The zombies came at them in waves, their numbers seeming to grow with every passing moment. Grant felt his strength beginning to wane, his body pushed to the limits of its endurance. But he refused to give up, refused to let the zombies win. He fought on, his rifle barking and his knife flashing, his every action fueled by a fierce, unyielding determination. And then, just when all seemed lost, the shuttle's engines roared to life. The survivors piled on board, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. Grant and the last few defenders made a mad dash for the shuttle, the zombies hot on their heels. They leapt through the open hatch, their bodies slamming against the metal floor as the shuttle lifted off. As they soared into the sky, Grant felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had made it, had escaped the nightmare of the prison and the spaceport. But even as he savored the moment of triumph, he knew that their ordeal was far from over. The zombie virus was still out there, waiting to strike again. And he knew that he would have to be ready, would have to continue the fight until the threat was finally vanquished. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of rest, his body slumping against the wall of the shuttle as the exhaustion of the past few days finally caught up with him. They had survived, but the battle was far from over, and Grant knew that he would be there, ready to lead the charge and protect the innocent, no matter the cost. It was who he was, and it was what he had been born to do. The UEN shuttle drifted through the endless expanse of space, its engines humming softly as it carried its precious cargo towards safety. Inside, the survivors of the prison outbreak huddled together, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. Grant sat apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the viewport as he watched the stars drift by. His mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by the events of the past few days. They had escaped the prison and the spaceport, but at a terrible cost. So many lives had been lost, so many brave souls sacrificed in the name of survival. And now, as they made their way back to UEN headquarters, Grant knew that the real work was just beginning. They had to warn the UEN of the resurgence of the zombie virus, had to make sure that the outbreak was contained before it could spread any further. He felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders, the burden of responsibility and leadership. He had led these survivors to safety, but he knew that he couldn't rest, couldn't allow himself to become complacent. The virus was still out there, waiting to strike again. and he had to be ready, had to do everything in his power to stop it. As the shuttle approached the UEN headquarters, Grant felt a sense of trepidation wash over him. He knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, would have to explain how the virus had escaped containment and spread to the prison. But he also knew that he had done what was necessary, had made the hard choices that had saved lives and prevented an even greater catastrophe. As the shuttle docked and the survivors disembarked, Grant was met by a team of UEN officials, their faces grim and their eyes filled with questions. He answered their queries as best he could, his voice steady and his gaze unwavering. And then, as the debriefing finally came to an end, Grant was approached by a high-ranking UEN officer, her face etched with determination. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "I have a new mission for you. We've received reports of a possible outbreak on a remote colony world, and we need someone with your skills and experience to investigate." Grant felt a flicker of apprehension, but he pushed it aside. He had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, to stand against the darkness no matter the cost. And so, with a nod of acceptance, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he boarded the shuttle that would take him to his next mission, Grant allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the survivors he had led to safety, of the sacrifices that had been made and the lives that had been lost. And he knew that he would carry their memory with him always, would use their example as a source of strength and inspiration in the battles to come. For he was a soldier, a warrior forged in the crucible of this nightmare, and he would not rest until the threat of the zombie virus was finally vanquished, until the innocent were safe and the darkness was banished forever. As the shuttle lifted off and soared into the endless expanse of space, Grant felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He knew that the road ahead would be long and treacherous, knew that he would face challenges and dangers beyond imagining. But he also knew that he was ready, that he had the strength and the will to see this fight through to the end. And so, with a deep breath and a steady hand, he set his course for the unknown, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The battle against the zombie virus was far from over, but with Grant leading the charge, the UEN had a fighting chance. And that was all he could ask for, all any of them could hope for in this brave new world of danger and uncertainty. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to subscribe and leave a like. I'll see you in our next video.